Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for turning out. I know mostly for the pizza, but I hope for maybe some intellectual nourishment as well. For those of you fortunate enough not to know me, I'm Dr. Ed Crowther, and I've been here for a long, long time, 30 years. And for about the last 10, I've been fortunate enough to have this incredible opportunity to be a part of really a core mission idea at a Hispanic serving institution to talk about one expression of equity and inclusion, and that is the life and career of Dr. King. And as I've tried to do over the years, not just focus on Dr. King, but use Dr. King's life and career as a lens to explore issues like race and change and institutional racism in the United States. I realized a few years ago, since I wasn't suffering from any maladies that appeared to have me headed for a quick extermination, that I was probably going to live through the 50th commemoration of Dr. King's life, 50 years since his assassination on April 4th, 1968, outside room 306 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee at about 6 p.m. as he's on his way to dinner at the home of Reverend Billy Kyles, who sadly passed a couple of years ago. Some of you might remember when Reverend Kyles was here. Really decent man, sorry, great guy. And you know, Dr. King's life, there's so many ways to appraise it, and what I want us to be able to do today, I want us using language from my old preacher in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and our thinking together, that was his verbiage, to think a little bit about the life of Dr. King, and then use that as sort of a metric to appraise something historians do, continuity and change. How much has changed? How much has changed for the better since King? How much has not changed? How much work remains yet to do? And so it's a big topic. And all of us, while we might bring much to the table, all of us have limitations. I certainly do. The image that you see is a powerful image. And we could spend an entire semester, I suppose, talking about the image, but this is April 9th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, and we're moving the 3 miles from Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. Sweet Auburn, one of the meccas of African American life in the United States. We're moving from the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Dr. King's father had been the pastor. Dr. King was the assistant pastor there at the time of his assassination. We're moving there to where Dr. King attained his undergraduate degree in sociology, by the way. He wanted to be a physician, and that wasn't his strength. And so moving on to Morehouse College, where Dr. King matriculated as an undergraduate, one of the HBCs. And of course, the Morehouse College is named after a white man, Henry L. Morehouse, who was the corresponding secretary of the American Baptist Home Missionary Society. And the money for Morehouse College came from none other than John David Rockefeller, which, as an idea, I'm putting that out there to suggest that a lot of what we think we know needs to be complicated a little bit. But in this incredible journey, right, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people turn out. And I love the image. 2 mules pulling a simple wagon with a coffin, bearing the remains of Dr. King. And of course, you wouldn't be here if you didn't know something about Dr. King, and many of you know a great deal about Dr. King. But there's a reason that we have a Dr. King holiday, and have had one since 1983, and I'll spare you the rant about the Reagan signing statement. If you want to see it, go back and look at my previous talks. But there's a reason for this, that for all the work that I try to do to help people understand that the civil rights movement is so much more than just Dr. King or about Dr. King, At the end of days, it's impossible to escape the conclusion that Dr. King is central to this movement. He's important to this movement. And finally, one can't have a whole understanding of the movement without appreciating Dr. King. Dr. King was born in 1929 and attended segregated schools in Georgia, matriculating and then from high school attending Morehouse College, then Crowther Theological Seminary, before attending Boston University to obtain a PhD, which he would complete in 1955. He assumed the pastorate. You can imagine he's the son of an eminent Baptist, a stalwart in the National Baptist Convention, the largest African-American Baptist ecclesiastical organization in the United States. And he chose to go to Montgomery, and it's just one of those deals. He had no idea. How could he know what he was getting himself into? And there was some piece about, well, why don't you go to Detroit? Or why don't you go work with your father in Atlanta? Because Montgomery, like it is today, was then very much a backwater in terms of its importance as a small American city. This is the one thing that I probably studied as much or more than anybody. It was a topic of opportunity. I was fascinated by Dr. King's becoming king. How do you become Martin Luther King? And how do you go from being a person that had these very understandable career aspirations as a minister to the Dr. King that gets a holiday? There's no way he could see it coming. And so I studied Dr. King, the student, and Dr. King in the first year of his pastorate in Montgomery, and I noted the changes. He used to have his secretary type out his sermons long, in typescript, and although he didn't read them, the fact is this took a great deal of effort. By the end of his career, he's speaking off the cuff because there is no time to prepare. And of course, there's a reason that Dr. King over and over and over again used Luke chapter 10 as sort of a metaphor for civil rights. So this is the Good Samaritan going down the Jericho road. And it's because he had used that in the sermon that he preached the Sunday before Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery. And he used that trope many times. And it's the trope that frames the "I've been to the mountaintop," King's last public address on April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. He really saw himself being what you could consider an urban pastor, a leader, a pillar in the black community. And then history happened. And one of the great ironies, King became the leader of what's called the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organizational arm for the Montgomery bus boycott, not because anybody saw him as a leader. It was because he had been in Montgomery for such a short time that he had not offended lots of people. And so they picked King because he's 26 years old, and it's like, well, nobody else is available. They didn't know what they were getting. And my point is, I don't think Dr. King knew what they were getting either. How could he? And yet what he brought was this incredible commitment born of his deep immersion in the African American social gospel, that the role of ministry was the elevation of humankind. And he added to that an incredible skill as an orator. And the other piece that I didn't think about this when I was a younger person. Somewhere along the way, he developed an incredible courage. He knew, like the person he identified as his risen Lord, that he would be crucified before his time. And increasingly as he gets older, he shares this idea with people. Imagine going out in public knowing that people who look and sound like me want you dead, and eventually one of them will make you dead. There's that famous scene in the Chicago movement in 1966 when a car backfires and King and the whole entourage duck. It sounded like a gunshot, and everybody knew it was coming. The great irony, when the gunshot did come on April 4th, 1968, the first response to car backfiring. Kind of an irony, isn't it? Life is full of ironies. As King became a national figure because of the Montgomery bus boycott, he and his fellow ministers founded something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that becomes the ecclesiastical organizational arm for the African American church to work in collaboration and sometimes in conflict with other regional and national organizations to effect social change for African Americans in the United States. That group would engage in a number of highly public demonstrations, trying to create what King called creative tension, trying to get the white racist state to enforce ridiculous laws, to bring public attention to the fact that the laws and customs associated with white supremacy did not do the United States, the promise of American life, any justice at all. And of course, it was in the pursuit of one of these demonstrations that King, at the invitation of the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth of Birmingham, went to Birmingham in April 1963, one of the pivotal events in the movement. We know now from movement veterans, and I was lucky enough to be part of the 50th commemoration of the Birmingham movement, that Birmingham was critical, that the civil rights movement had sort of reached a standstill. And then something big happened. Newsreel images that you must have in your head of Bull Connor's police dogs and fire hoses being turned on little middle school age boys and girls because, you know, white supremacists really don't have filters or boundaries. King was arrested for violating an injunction for exercising his First Amendment rights. And he goes to jail, and while he's in jail, he writes the very famous, I think it's the source of everybody's famous King quotes, his letter from Birmingham City Jail. You know, that's the one, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And if I were doing this as a class, you know, an academic class, I would say that you go to this document to get King's description for how to engage in nonviolent protest, because so much of the body of the work details his understanding of how this tactic can be an effective instrument for social change. As a part of the March for Jobs and Justice in August 1963, King was one of the speakers at the Lincoln Memorial in August 1963. And of course, he probably there delivers his most famous oration. If you know the letters and papers of King, he just said what he'd been saying all along, but it was the first time many people saw it on the media. And of course, in most Martin Luther King commemorations, the I Have a Dream speech frames how we understand the life and career of Dr. King. It makes him a national and international sensation, and the result would be in 1964 that King would receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Hard to say that it wasn't well earned. In 1965, after what is called Bloody Sunday in early March 1965, Dr. King was part of the second Selma to Montgomery March. It's amazing. It's named the Walter Gavan Highway, U.S. Highway 80. Walter Gavan was a member of the White Citizens Council. Before the march, it was just called the Highway 80, U.S. Highway 80. Later, the legislature in Alabama named that highway after the leader of the White Citizens Council. I'm sure it was just a coincidence. The reason that march matters, well, there are manifold reasons, but I picked this bullet point for a reason. It provided the public demonstration of the dire need for massive federal intervention under the rubric of the 15th Amendment in the voting rights process in the various states. The Constitution leaves to the states all manner of things regarding voting. And so the result was, in August of 1965, just before the Watts riots, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the area of African American participation in the United States, there is no other more important piece of legislation, which is why so many of us lament the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 to gut that act in the case of Shelby versus Holder. Surely just another coincidence. But the point is that whether we think of Dr. King as an inspiring symbol or an activist, his inspiration and activism yielded tangible, measurable policy change that if we think inclusion is important, we would say change for the better. Most of the time when we talk about Dr. King, it stops right here. Because what happens after 1965, although it was already complicated if you were African American, but if you're a white person watching, you go, oh my God, things are really a mess. We've got rioting Negroes in Watts, and we've got, who is this guy, this Stokely Carmichael, and what is Black Power? And the movement seems really complex, and then King begins to move the center of his activity from the former Confederacy to larger cities outside the Confederacy, specifically Chicago. And he would talk about this before he died. There was that sense, he thought, many people thought, that if you integrated the schools and you created voting rights for black people, it was problem solved. And King began to grapple with why things weren't as easy as legislative change. We have somebody with us today who got to hear Dr. King give what I think was his greatest and most important address, which is why we don't normally do this on Martin Luther King Day or week, because it is an uncomfortable message. In Riverside Church, a church built by the Rockefellers for their favorite preacher, a man named Harry Emerson Fosdick, in the Upper West Side, just a short 9-iron from Grant's tomb. There's some of the beautiful real estate in the country. In Riverside Church, Dr. King tried to diagnose what was wrong. And as a minister, he used theological language. And he said this, he said, what we've done in the United States, and he meant we, he meant everybody. He didn't just mean white people from Mississippi. We have abandoned a higher calling for what he called acquisitive materialism, which transforms the United States from a person-oriented society to a thing-oriented society. And institutional racism and white supremacy at home and aggressive, violent imperialism abroad, he believed to be the two manifestations establishing his central thesis that the abandonment of a life of concern for other people was killing the United States. Maybe that's why this one doesn't preach so well. It hits close to home often. True to his mission, Dr. King believed that helping people really mattered, and while he is trying to plan the Poor People's Campaign, where poor people were going to take over the National Mall, to demonstrate for something King came to advocate late in his life, economic justice, including asset and income redistribution. I find it interesting that one political party that's totally opposed to those ideas tries to claim Dr. King as their own. Just another coincidence. Dr. King went to support sanitation workers after 2 sanitation workers had been killed by the faulty trash compaction equipment that they operated, into which they had retreated during a rainstorm, and they had been crushed to death. And their families could not even use the death benefit because it was insufficient to pay for the cost of the funeral. Dr. King went to support the sanitation workers in Memphis because they were people in need. And of course, accompanying Dr. King was his assassin, James Earl Ray, who killed Dr. King, we believe, for 2 reasons. One, he thought, as a white person, this would give him standing. Hey, look, other white people, I'm the guy that killed the guy you hate. Oh, and by the way, he thought there might be money involved. A consortium of white supremacists in St. Louis had put out money, in essence, a contract for anybody that would kill Dr. King. Isn't that amazing? And the FBI knew it, but oh well, another coincidence. Even in death, Dr. King's tactics and strategies bore policy fruit, and the result, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, sometimes called the Fair Housing Act. As King began to think about helping others, the idea that people can't necessarily have a roof over their heads, not because they can't pay, but because of policies that are put in place to maintain racial apartheid, results in the inadequate, inappropriate, unjust, unfair allocation of housing. Today, if you're part of the disabled community or you're part of the LGBT community, you can thank Dr. King because subsequent legislation amended this act to say that people can't refuse to sell you a house or rent you a house because of your ethnicity, because of your sexuality, because of your physical ability, right? It's a pretty important thing. And yes, it is an interference with property rights, which is always trotted out as kind of the argument against this kind of intervention. And so the point is, there's a reason there's a King holiday. Even if we just stop talking about Dr. King at the time that he died, what he did really, really mattered. I think Dr. King continues to matter because many of you, I know this of you, people are telling me, did you know this quote from Dr. King? Dr. King's words still inspire, and that is no small accomplishment. Maybe more so than William Shakespeare, who was very good at describing the foibles of the human condition. Dr. King's words invite people to rise above the limitations of the human condition, and that's just not a bad thing at all. And so these are just, three that I happen to like. This one is on the poster, and it's from the I Have a Dream speech, but I really think that one matters. And the universality of King, as he became older and came to realize that Mississippi and South Africa and Belfast, Northern Ireland have a lot in common. The human foibles that create injustice are global in some sense in nature, and they have a global solution. So quickly, and I did this deliberately because we could do this forever and never reach conclusion. Since Martin Luther King, there have been things, those of you that know me, and I often describe myself as Eeyore, I have to say there have been things since King that seem pretty positive. Spoiler alert, it's not all bad news. Spoiler alert, some of the news is really, really good. I was thinking, because a young woman in my class, civil rights class, did something really cool. She was talking about civil rights icons, and she listed a Massachusetts woman named Mum Bet. Mum Bet was the plaintiff in one of the first freedom suits after the American Revolution, the reason slavery ended in Massachusetts. And I think about Mum Bet. If she could see from the vantage point of 1780, it was hard to fathom that you would have African American elected officials, right? That was actually going to happen. And so a significant increase. I know it's an underrepresentation, but the underrepresentation used to be a number like 0. So this is a big dang deal. And a mayor of a southern city, Maynard Jackson, the first mayor of Atlanta, Shirley Chisholm from Harlem, sitting in the United States House of Representatives, Mayor Coleman Young in Detroit, wonderful, wonderfully important figure. And of course, yes, his middle name is Hussein. And he doesn't have a birth certificate. It's a certificate of live birth, just like yours. But Barack Obama, who would have imagined that Barack Hussein Obama could get elected to the White House? I struggled to come up with a word for this because I know a whole lot about the problems in the legal system. But I know that the one that we have now is better for all of its manifold imperfections than the one that it replaced. And so that's a big dang deal. Because you know how the legal system used to work? If it just wasn't in my interest, I didn't arrest you and cite you. I shot and killed you. That's a difference. We don't routinely do that. I think this is awesome, and I want to thank Uhura Williams, who was here last year, for forcing me, because I'm not inclined to do this, forcing me to look at everything from the visual arts to hip-hop, to think about these as vehicles for communicating not only the need and tactic to empower, but actually for acquiring cultural power in American public life. And so the fact that in literature classes people read Maya Angelou alongside Elizabeth Barrett Browning, right? And the fact that young people listen to Public Enemy and other groups, I think that's pretty important, that there's a kind of, as there's always been, a creolization of cultural forms and styles, and that's pretty cool. I did this next one deliberately because I think some people need to get comfortable looking at a word. Some people go to AA, but this is the other AA. This is affirmative action. And it was really important. And it might still be really important. And here's the thing. There are African Americans who can point and say, because of affirmative action, I had an opportunity that historically would have been denied people like me, and look at what I did. And so Henry Louis Gates, besides getting arrested by a white officer for breaking into his own house, is a tenured professor at Harvard. And lots of people buy his books and watch his shows on PBS. He was a classmate at Yale with a woman you may not know if you're not from Texas. But Sheila Jackson, now Sheila Jackson Lee, has been a U.S. Congresswoman from the Texas 18th Congressional District for a quarter of a century, and she's awesome. And so how could she move from her background to being a Congresswoman? Well, you know, I can tell you that a Juris Doctorate from Yale will take you a lot of places, so go get one. There is no doubt, when we do the measurement, there was always an African American professional class. People who sold burial insurance, people who were ministers, people who were teachers and school officials, but it's exponentially larger. And so what that means is there are children being born to black parents who enjoy the benefits that those of us lucky enough to have had middle class and upper middle class parents already enjoyed. That is good news, right? This one's hard, but I think the two ways of thinking about this, my latest person that I research is a guy named Richard Henry Boyd, and he was a black minister who took to selling black dolls to black children at the turn of the 20th century. And what happens is, you know, black becomes beautiful. Now, black people always got that, but there was always a little bit of a doubt, you know. And so you think of black as not a deficit to overcome, and instead of doing the Michael Jackson skin whitening thing and straightening your hair, you just do the black thing. And so even in the African American community, that blackness is something to be celebrated, not something to be modified. That's not a small thing. And for all the things that aren't true down this little road, the fact that this road is wider is not an unimportant thing. It's just not that big of a deal anymore for black and white people to get together and do things, and not just in the athletic fields, but in the boardrooms. And honestly, in the bedrooms. It was illegal in 1967 for the Lovings to be married to one another in the state of Virginia. That is no longer true. And so, good news, lots of good news. This was an afterthought, and I have to blame somebody. Where's Matt? I'll blame Matt Nearing for this, because you know we have to have these really cool syllabi, and so I had to change up the syllabi. And I have a picture of the body of Michael Donald and a Dylan Roof. And there's a reason. And I was asking my U.S. history students, because there are other black bodies on the syllabus. You need psychotherapy if you take one of my classes. You do. The lynchers of Michael Donald were brought to justice, and one was executed. Dylan Roof was convicted. And you go, well, yeah. No. When they were looking for the bodies of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner in 1964, and they're dragging the rivers in Mississippi, they're finding all kinds of murdered black bodies. And nobody was ever brought to account. I'm happy to report that Edgar Ray Killen died this past week. He was one of the killers of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, and he died in prison. But we didn't used to do this, and I think that that's a change, right? It's not the same thing as solving the problem for the need for Black Lives Matter, but it's not a small step. And so here are, Shirley Chisholm and Maynard Young and Skip Gates and Maya Angelou and Sheila Davis, really, really important people in the last 50 years doing things because of the success of the civil rights movement. But yeah, there are problems, and they're big, and they've been big, and they don't go away because we wish them away, and they certainly won't go away if we deny them. This is huge. Resegregation of public schools. See if I get comments on this on YouTube. Milliken v. Bradley is the Dred Scott decision in school law of the 20th century. It treated school districts as neutral, as the product of neutral forces, because we know when we define districts politically, when we use a political process to reach a decision, there certainly can't be any class bias, race bias, economic bias, partisan bias, or ethnic bias, because our politics are all neutral, right? Okay. And so what's happened is, through a variety of phenomena, and read Kevin Cruz's book, White Flight, about suburban Atlanta. Don't read it alone. Don't read it around drugs or alcohol. Just don't, but read it. And here's the piece. So you have these schools that are in districts where there is no money. And the people who are responsible for those schools, particularly the parents, are relatively politically powerless. That's why this matters. That's why Bob Moses and Janet Moses have the Algebra Project. Because how are kids who come from powerless areas politically and economically ever going to learn algebra? And ever going to have access to the kinds of formal skills that you need in a global economy? That's a problem. And I wish I had a solution. I don't. Related to this are what I call the left behinds. What happens when in African American communities people rise up and leave those communities because they're educated and affluent? What about those people who are left behind? And of course I'll show you the map, the obvious demonstration of food deserts, right? And grocery stores move out, fast foods move in, and suddenly we're dealing with obesity and diabetes, and we're saying, well, those people just need to learn to eat healthier. Always making it their problem, right? It's one of those things. I'm not going to pick on Ronald Reagan. He's dead, but he's really not the source of this line, although he told a story about a single woman who was a con artist and went to jail, right? She was prosecuted, may have murdered her husband. I mean, it's a great story, right? And her name is Linda Taylor. And she is, although African American, she would easily pass for white. She shows up on the 1930 census in Tennessee as a white woman. It's one of those things. But the idea that somewhere somebody scammed the welfare system served to demonize in the minds of many people who just don't like taking care of other people, that, well, the welfare system is corrupt, and all these people on welfare don't want to get off of welfare, don't want to work, and they're all driving around in Cadillacs. There's one problem with that characterization. It just ain't so. It's based on one single data point, and that woman was arrested, prosecuted, and brought to justice. Just one of those things. This one's hard. I picked on a young man yesterday and he was good about it. Just so people could see. Black men get it. Women who are parents of black men get it. Black men who are parents get it. And people really chastened Obama for talking about it because, oh gosh, he's just a black parent. But black males have a hard time. It's not that all people don't have a hard time. It's that black males have a particularly hard time because sometimes non-black people and older black people look at black males and think, oh my God, are they going to rob me? Maybe they're going to give you directions to the place you're looking for. But that image is out there, and it's hard to grapple with. It's hard to grapple with things that cause us fear, that we're socialized to be afraid of. And that's just one of those, another hard truth. White flight we've talked about, but we'll talk about social steering. Where we live, which affects schooling, is not a product of a neutral marketplace. It does have market features, right? But when you come as a black professional to a community, I'm going to show you a bunch of houses. And isn't it going to be funny what that neighborhood's going to look like? There'll be other black people just like you, and you're going to pay more for it. But if you're poor, you're not going to be shown houses in a poor white working class neighborhood. You know this is redlining. Social steering takes other forms too. When you come into my office and say, oh, Dr. Crowther, I'd like to, think about my career options at Adams State, and I steer you into a major that's appropriate, right, for you, right? And so we tell African Americans, don't study engineering, or don't do this, or you'll be more suited for that. And it has an impact. It has an impact on quality of life. It has an impact, a disparate impact on pursuit of the American dream. I can't fix this one, but I'm trying, and I'm probably trying ineffectively. Because of a lot of things that happened as the World War II economic boom ended, including the deindustrialization of the United States economy, the emphasis on finance in the economy rather than the production of goods, jobs vanished. And so white people, rather than saying, Wall Street, why are you doing this to us? Blamed busing, affirmative action, and immigrants, because that's what they were encouraged to blame. And they have this idea that, well, but for the civil rights movement, I'd have a bass boat. Well, there may be a lot of reasons that you don't have a bass boat, including the fact that you didn't learn math and science in high school, right? There could be, but it's not the fault of Dr. King any more than it was the fault of Barack Obama. But this idea is there, that but for, it's kind of like, well, before slavery, white people didn't have to, right. Yeah, that's right, that's true. And this is what you can conclude. I want to thank Skip Gates. I was looking for something to say, and so I sort of modified. It's hard to get inside of all the things that make up a person and cause us to react and think and feel and believe and process our experiences and challenge that immune system that sort of makes everything that happens to me someone else's fault and makes me prone to believe dominant social mythologies. That's a hard one. Maybe it's a good thing that Dr. King was a preacher because he could believe in the possibility of change and redemption. I'm not always sure that I do, but Dr. King was a better person. It's one of those things. I thought this might happen, so. Here she is, Linda Taylor. She's the one welfare queen. So this is where black people live in Chicago. This is where there are no grocery stores. And if I were to lay those over, you see how this works? I struggle with some of my young students that the relationship requires me. I'm talking about football players, how they eat their food. I struggle with trying to get them to learn to cook. Imagine not being able to buy food to cook, right? That would be hard, right? So you have the choice of fast food. Gas station burritos, a real nutritional choice. And of course, I wanted to stay away from this, but this is Trayvon Martin. And sort of the last minute, I just put that back up there. I remember when the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin case was playing out, foolishly, and I think Lori has taken the computer away from me, I'm reading the postings, and yet they were very instructive. Because the postings by people of color, you want to make sure that Trayvon Martin is small and demure, and the postings by mean, angry white people, he's this menacing black guy in a hoodie. I don't understand the hoodie thing. People let me go around like this. Nothing could be scarier or more offensive than that. But a fascinating thing. And so we have these challenges that are there to deal with. And so, you know, I just hit a few that are there. And you know most of these. I gave you points to think about. I wished this hadn't come up again, but then denying it doesn't make it go away. There seems to be a hardcore pocket of people that would do Adolf Hitler proud, and they truly believe in the biological inferiority of non-white people. And then this is the favorite mythology. I learned about this just this fall after Charlottesville, Virginia. There's the belief that there's this giant myth or giant activity by the multiculturalist to exterminate the white race. Right? That white people are about to be the targets of genocide. I don't know how you convince people that that isn't so, right? Particularly living in the echo chambers in which we live. Who's going to tell a white supremacist that maybe it ain't so? Another white supremacist? I don't think that's going to happen. We've talked about this in the past, but we have practices and policies that really harm young people. And so we'll talk about the 3 strikes, or we'll talk about zero tolerance in schools. So a 7-year-old does this, bang, bang, and we call the police because that's what you do, right? A 7-year-old black male gets a police record. Really going to make you feel good about school and about the judicial system, right? And by the way, now you're an incorrigible in school, and so I'm wondering if you're ever going to get any skills. And so by the time you're 15, maybe you've dropped out of the system, and you commit a petty crime, and you peddle some crack cocaine, and you face 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. And instead of committing a misdemeanor, you've committed a felony. And the attorney comes in and plea bargains and said, we're going to get them to drop the charges, and you sign this paper, and you'll not vote again for the rest of your life. And we do this. This is a word, I stole this from Michelle Alexander, the carceral state. Many people who study this issue say what we've finally done, I say we, and it's everybody. It's right. What we've finally done, we don't know what to do with lots of young black men, and so we warehouse them, ultimately in prisons. And so we call it, the prison industrial complex. Here's one that we all live in. And this is really directed not as a condemnation, but hopefully as an awareness. There was not an All Lives Matter before there was a Black Lives Matter, which should suggest something to you. And the All Lives Matter really becomes this way of saying to a person who is upset about police violence on black people, hey, it's not so bad for you, all lives matter. When police shoot black people for the crime of being black, that is a sign that black lives don't seem to matter as much as white lives. And so what we end up doing is creating a discourse that does not tell the truth. It does not acknowledge the fact that while all people have individual and collective problems, The historical record is clear. Some people bear the burden of history and ongoing racism at a much greater rate than other people. And to tell that person, you're wrong to feel this way. I'm glancing at one of my psychotherapist friends who's just been a wonderful gift. You learn to listen to people rather than to tell people who are different from you how they ought to feel. I have never been black a single day in my life. I have never been Latino a single day in my life. I have never been female a single day in my life. So no, I don't really know exactly how you feel. So I should have empathy rather than mansplaining voice when I listen to you. And so people of color, when they see this, it's like, really? We're just asking for your help with the problem. Don't tell me your problem is just like my problem. Nobody has shot you in the face for running a stop sign. That one's hard because, we'll just skip that, but just, right? We'll skip that one too, but it's important, right? We're going to come back to the thing. So many of us who are privileged operate from a set of assumptions that we are the standard, that we are the norm, and that difference must reconcile itself to us. Learn Spanish? It's America. We speak English here. You know how funny that is coming from somebody who's from Mississippi? Really? Right? And so sometime read this book by Ibram X. Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. It is a powerful book on how unintentionally, but sometimes very intentionally, racism operates in our educational system, in our religious beliefs, in our cultural beliefs, economic practices, and all of those systems that they engender. It's kind of a, yeah, Ibram is a professor at the University of Florida. There are problems. There are positive changes. And there are ripples of hope. Let's let Maya Angelou have a voice here. I know that she knew that there were problems still. But you go to the White House because you're a poet and people read you. And she's measuring, right, what her generation had done compared to the generations of black people before. I believe Theodore Parker, the 19th century abolitionist, is the original source of the quote, except Martin flipped a word. So I'm going to give Martin the quote. There is hope. It just takes time. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Pretty powerful stuff, right? Dr. King in 1955 could not have seen the Voting Rights Act of 1965 coming. It came. It took a while, right? Just one of those things. Two books, because I think, you know, people are kind, they listen to me sometimes. But two really accessible books on Dr. King. Vincent Harding, who used to teach at Iliff here in Denver, at Iliff Theological Seminary. He's an African American with a Chicago PhD. He's a Mennonite and very close to Dr. King in the early 1960s. I like the subtitle, The Inconvenient Hero. All right? King doesn't make anybody feel comfortable. Of all the books I've assigned about King to students, this one has been the most successful, Harvard Sitkoff, Pilgrimage to the Mountaintop. It's a tremendous book, and both of these weigh in at about 250 pages. So even in our, Instagram universe, our Twitter universe, this is good. You can do this. I know you can. And I talked about Vincent Harding to say this. So we need to think about King. And maybe why. because in the end, Dr. King was about civil rights for black people, but it was to make the United States better. He thought redemptive suffering would make the world a better place. And when we turn King into Santa Claus, we miss the opportunity to learn from what Dr. King was trying to teach us, which is to move beyond what is easy and to move beyond the self and to choose to do this. This is why I love Vincent Harding. He can write because he could think. We can learn to play on locked pianos and dream of worlds that do not yet exist. Wow, pretty awesome. You see, when Dr. King took that first stride toward freedom, he did not know where he was going specifically, but he had the courage to take that step toward moving from where he was toward a better place. And I hope we can all decide that that's worth doing ourselves. So thank you for being here. If somebody has questions or comments, we can do that. But thank you so much for letting me talk about Dr. King with you today. Yes, sir.
How is our current situation in Washington?
You know,
affect all this?
It doesn't help. I mean, one of the news stories this morning, the questions about current politics. If the President of the United States can act in a tyrannical fashion, it encourages other tyrants and dictators. It does not help. On the other hand, because it's out there, we know we can't just hide in a comfortable place and assume everything's okay. Things are not okay. But things weren't okay in 1955 either.
We have to do our part, right?
We have to do our part. That's so well said. Okay. Thank you all.